In 1274 BC, on a dusty plain beside a river in what is now Syria, two of the greatest empires on earth collided. On one side, Ramesses the Great, pharaoh of Egypt, a living god descending on his enemies in a golden chariot. On the other, an empire so feared, so technologically advanced, that even Egypt's armies trembled at its name. 6,000 chariots, tens of thousands of men, the largest chariot battle in human history. Ramesses would go home and carve his version of the story across a dozen temple walls, boasting of a glorious victory. But here's the truth the stone doesn't tell you. He lost. Or at best he survived by the skin of his teeth, saved from total annihilation by his own soldiers while his enemies' chariots tore through his camp. And the empire that did that to him? Most people alive today have never even heard its name. This is the entire history of the Hittites, the forgotten superpower who fought Egypt to a standstill, who cracked the secret of iron before almost anyone else on earth, and who vanished so completely that for 3,000 years the only place they existed was in a single, brief mention in the Bible. Historians thought they were a myth. They weren't. Rewind the clock nearly 1,000 years before Kadesh, to around 1700 BC. The land is Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a rugged plateau of harsh winters, thin soil, and scattered rivers, hemmed in by mountains on almost every side. It's not the kind of place empires are supposed to be born. There's no great river valley like the Nile or the Tigris to feed a civilization. No easy, fertile floodplain handing you food on a platter. If Egypt was a garden, Anatolia was a fortress, beautiful but unforgiving. And that's exactly what made the people who rose there different. The Hittites weren't handed abundance. They had to fight the land itself just to survive. And a people who learn to survive a landscape like that don't stay soft for long. They called their own land Hatti, and themselves the people of the land of Hatti, though we know them today by the name later civilizations gave them, the Hittites. Their origins are still debated by historians, but the evidence points to migrants who arrived in Anatolia sometime before 2000 BC, speaking a language that would turn out to be one of the biggest linguistic discoveries of the 20th century. When scholars finally deciphered Hittite texts in the early 1900s, they found something stunning. It was Indo-European. That means Hittite is a linguistic cousin, however distant, of English, of Latin, of Sanskrit. Somewhere in that Anatolian plateau, thousands of years ago, people were speaking a language related to the one you're listening to right now. They didn't build their civilization from nothing. Anatolia was already dotted with local city-states, kingdoms of native Hattian peoples with their own gods and their own power structures. The incoming Hittite speakers didn't wipe them out. They absorbed them, married into them, adopted their gods, layered their own language and rule on top like sediment. This habit of absorbing rather than erasing would define the Hittites for the rest of their existence. By around 1650 BC, one man was ready to turn scattered survival into something far more dangerous, an empire. His name was Hattusili I, and he did something that shouldn't have been possible from a landlocked plateau kingdom with no natural advantages. He started conquering everyone around him. He pushed south into Syria. He smashed rival Anatolian powers, and he moved the capital to a city that would become the beating heart of Hittite power for the next 500 years, Hattusa, a fortress city carved into rocky hills, ringed by walls so massive that even in ruins today they still humble visitors who climb them. Picture it, a city built less like a home and more like a clenched fist. Hattusa wasn't chosen because it was comfortable. It was chosen because it was defensible. Steep terrain, natural rock formations reinforced with cyclopean stone walls, hidden postern tunnels for troops to move unseen beneath the ramparts. This was a civilization that understood, from birth, that survival meant being harder to kill than your neighbors. But Hattusili's real legacy wasn't just conquest. It was what came after him, and almost undid everything. When he died, the throne passed to his grandson, Mursili I, and Mursili did something audacious almost beyond belief. He didn't just consolidate the new kingdom, he marched his armies over 1,000 miles southeast, all the way down the Euphrates River, and sacked one of the most powerful cities in the entire ancient world, Babylon. Around 1595 BC, the Hittites brought down the dynasty of Hammurabi himself, the same Hammurabi whose law code still gets taught in classrooms today. A kingdom from the Anatolian mountains had just toppled Mesopotamia's greatest power. And then, almost immediately, it fell apart. Mursili marched home a hero and was assassinated by his own brother-in-law. What followed was a century of the very thing that had built the kingdom in the first place. Ruthless ambition, now turned inward. Coups, assassinations, kings murdered by their own family. It's almost a betrayal of irony. The Hittites had just out-conquered Babylon, and now they couldn't stop conquering each other. This period is sometimes called the Hittite Old Kingdom's decline, and it nearly killed the whole project in its crib. For decades the kingdom shrank, its borders bled by rivals, and its throne treated like a prize to be murdered for. It took one king to break the cycle, and what he did next didn't just save the Hittites. It created one of the most remarkable political documents of the ancient world. His name was Telepinu, and around 1500 BC, he did something almost no ancient ruler thought to do. Instead of just seizing the throne and ruling by fear like his predecessors, he wrote down the rules. The Telepinu Proclamation laid out, in exact terms, how succession would work from now on. Who could inherit the throne? What would happen to a king or queen who committed murder within the royal family? It even limited the king's own power to execute rivals on a whim, insisting on formal trials before the assembled nobility instead of blood vengeance. Think about what that meant in the ancient world. This wasn't a king demanding obedience because he was a god, the way Egypt's pharaohs did. This was a Hittite king essentially saying, even I am bound by rules, even the throne itself has to follow law. It's one of the earliest known attempts in human history to solve a problem every dynasty on earth eventually faces. How do you pass power along without everyone murdering each other for it? It didn't fix everything, but it stabilized the kingdom enough to survive. And survival was about to matter more than ever, because the Hittites were entering their most dangerous and most brilliant century. Fast forward to around 1350 BC. A new kind of king takes the Hittite throne, Suppiluliuma I, arguably the single most consequential ruler in Hittite history. Suppiluliuma didn't just want to survive. He wanted an empire that could stand toe-to-toe with Egypt itself, and he got it. He crushed the kingdom of Mitanni, a major power in northern Syria, and folded its territory into Hittite control. He turned conquered kings into vassals rather than corpses, a strategy that let the Hittites govern a vastly diverse empire without garrisoning every mile of it. Local kings kept their thrones. In exchange, they swore loyalty treaties to Hattusa, sent tribute, and supplied troops on demand. This is worth pausing on, because it's genuinely ahead of its time. The Hittites became master treaty makers. Their diplomatic archive, discovered by archaeologists at Hattusa, include some of the most detailed international treaties in the ancient world. Legal documents specifying borders, extradition of fugitives, military alliances, even the return of runaway laborers between kingdoms. This was Bronze Age international law, written in clay, sealed, and stored in royal archives, like a Bronze Age State Department. And then there was the secret weapon that made the Hittites the terror of the age: iron. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the material of every major army on Earth at the time. But tin was rare, and every civilization that wanted bronze had to import it from far-flung trade networks. Iron ore, on the other hand, was almost everywhere. The problem was that smelting it properly required much higher heat and much greater skill. The Hittites were among the very first civilizations to master ironworking at scale, and they treated the knowledge like a state secret. Diplomatic letters have survived in which foreign kings begged the Hittite court for iron goods, and the Hittites teased them out slowly. A gift here, a promise there, never handing over the full technique. It was, in effect, the ancient world's version of a nuclear monopoly. Combine iron-edged weapons with a professional, chariot-based army, and you get an empire that by the mid-1300s BC controlled most of Anatolia and a huge swath of northern Syria. There was only one power left in the region big enough to challenge them: Egypt. By the reign of Suppiluliuma's successors, Hittite and Egyptian ambitions in Syria had been grinding against each other for decades. Border cities changing hands, vassal kings switching allegiance, proxy skirmishes flaring up and dying down. It was, in many ways, the Bronze Age's version of a Cold War along a very hot border. Then, in 1274 BC, it boiled over. The new pharaoh, Ramesses II, young, ambitious, hungry to prove himself as a warrior king, marched north with a massive Egyptian army, divided into 4 divisions, to reclaim the strategic city of Kadesh on the Orontes River. Waiting for him was Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites, with his own army, and crucially, with the largest chariot force ever assembled up to that point in history, estimated at somewhere around 3,500 vehicles. Here's where the story turns almost cinematic. Muwatalli hid his main force behind the city of Kadesh itself, out of sight. Egyptian scouts captured 2 Hittite spies, who under interrogation likely deliberately planted disinformation, convinced Ramesses that the Hittite army was still far to the north. Confident, Ramesses pushed ahead with only a fraction of his forces, badly overextended, his divisions strung out miles apart along the march. It was a trap, and it worked. The Hittite chariots burst out from behind Kadesh and smashed directly into the unprepared Egyptian camp. Ramesses' lead division was overrun. For a moment, the pharaoh himself was nearly cut off and captured, surrounded in his own camp by an enemy chariot charge, a scene so dramatic that Egyptian propaganda later turned it into a tale of Ramesses single-handedly fighting off the entire Hittite army with the help of his god Amun. What actually saved him was almost certainly a relief force, the timely arrival of reinforcements, and the Hittite chariots eventually bogging down to loot the captured Egyptian camp instead of finishing the job. The battle ended in a bloody, exhausted stalemate. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides had been mauled, and here's the part textbooks love. Roughly 15 years later, in 1259 BC, Ramesses and the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, of its power. A treaty with Egypt, dominance over Anatolia and Syria, centuries of dynastic experience behind them. They had no idea they were only a few decades from oblivion. Around 1200 BC, something happened across the entire eastern Mediterranean world that historians still argue about today. Within the span of roughly 50 years, nearly every major Bronze Age civilization either collapsed outright or was catastrophically weakened. Mycenaean Greece, the Egyptian New Kingdom, though it survived, was crippled. City after city across the region was burned and never rebuilt. This period is now known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic systems failures in human history. The Hittite Empire didn't survive it. The exact causes are still debated, and it was likely a perfect storm rather than a single knockout blow. Climate records suggest a prolonged drought struck the eastern Mediterranean around this time, and Anatolia's marginal farmland, the same land that had forced the Hittites to become tough and resourceful in the first place, turned from a challenge into a death sentence. Hittite royal letters from the final years actually survive begging Egypt for emergency grain shipments, a startling image. The empire that once nearly conquered Egypt, now pleading with it just to feed its own people. At the same time, a mysterious wave of raiders and displaced peoples the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples swept across the region, sacking cities from Greece to the Levant. Trade routes that every Bronze Age kingdom depended on, for tin, for grain, for luxury goods that cemented political alliances, collapsed almost overnight. And a network of powers as interdependent as the Bronze Age world meant that when a few major pieces fell, the whole board came down with them. Around 1190 to 1180 BC, Hattusa, the mighty fortress capital, walls thick enough to have withstood centuries of enemies, was burned and abandoned. Archaeologists who excavated the site found something haunting. It wasn't looted the way a city sacked by an enemy usually is. Valuable objects were left behind. Some historians now believe the royal family may have evacuated in an organized retreat before the final destruction, taking their most portable treasures and abandoning the rest, rather than being overrun in a single violent siege. Either way, the center did not hold. The Hittite royal line, the treaties, the archives, the empire that had once stared down Egypt, it simply stopped. Here's the twist most people never learn. The Hittites didn't vanish all at once. In the ruins of the empire, smaller successor kingdoms clung on for centuries in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. City-states like Carchemish and Melid, ruled by kings who still called themselves Hittite, still used Hittite hieroglyphic script, still worshipped the old gods. Historians call this the Neo-Hittite period, and it lingered for another 400 years, slowly fading, absorbed piece by piece by the rising Assyrian Empire. And then, almost total silence. For nearly 3,000 years, the word Hittite survived in exactly one place most people would recognize. A handful of passing mentions in the Hebrew Bible, referring to a people living in Canaan. For centuries, scholars assumed this was a minor, possibly even fictional tribe. A footnote, not an empire. It wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s, when archaeologists began excavating strange ruins in central Turkey and puzzling over inscriptions in an unknown script found across the region, that the truth came roaring back. In 1906, German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began digging at a site called Bogazko and unearthed the royal archive of Hattusa itself. Thousands of clay tablets, the actual state records of the Hittite Empire, buried and forgotten for 3 millennia. An entire empire, one that had fought Egypt to a draw, sacked Babylon, mastered iron, and signed history's first peace treaty, had to be dug out of the dirt to prove it ever existed at all. If you stay till the end of this story, kindly subscribe, like and drop a comment on what your favorite part of this story. I will see you on the next one.